All right, guys, welcome back to our functional anatomy videos. And today we're looking at the adductor group, which is a kind of a big muscle group, kind of takes you a while to wrap your head around it. It's really important muscles and often overlooked in rehab, in fitness, in training, just generally, mainly because you kind of can't see them really. So they're hard to visualize and hard to kind of appreciate just exactly how important they are. So we're going to spend some time today, like really looking a little bit more in-depthly into the adductors and just how amazing they are as a muscle group. So the first thing, as always, we are using complete anatomy, and I'm just going to be showing you the surface level of complete anatomy. I really highly recommend you go and purchase your own version of it. It's such a cool learning tool. I can't recommend it enough. So we're looking at complete anatomy. We're on the muscular system here, and I've prepared it so we've got 6 of the adductor muscles in this image. So we've got the Sartorius, then up here we have the Pectineus, then we have the longissimus muscle or Adductor Longus, and then behind that we've got Adductor brevis, and then we've got this one here which is Adductor Magnus, and then we've got Gracilis here as well. So these muscles make up the primary adductor muscle group, and they work as one group, meaning often when you are adducting your leg, they are co-contracting, as in they're all firing together to help move the femur on the inside. So adductor means add, so bring together. So typically adduction means that you're moving a limb from anywhere really in the body towards the midline. So for example, if your knee is going in this direction or the femur is going in this direction, that's adduction. So these muscles, a part of their job is to bring the leg into the middle. Because we have the adductors up here which cross hip joint, they also do what's called hip flexion. So they lift your knee up towards your chest. So if we go this way, so they'll bring your knee up this way, or the femur moves up that way. And also because we've got 2 of these adductors here crossing the knee joint, they are weak knee flexors as well. So they assist the hamstrings and the calves a little bit, although it's not their primary job. They don't like to do that on their own. And then also we have, pardon me, depending on the position of femur, we have hip internal rotation or external rotation. And we'll talk a bit more about that. It kind of depends on where the orientation of the femur is, but primarily the hip external rotators. But there's a little bit of a kind of a dichotomy here, because even though they're going to rotate the femur, rotate it externally, so the kneecap will rotate outwards, we're also getting a strong pull of the whole bone inwards. So you can kind of get what's called a valgus knee and an externally rotated leg. So what that means is that the knee or the femur is getting rotated externally, so turning outward, but at the same time, the whole leg is getting pulled inward, or adduction. So then that creates a big torque on the knee, and it compresses the lateral aspect of the knee and the discs, and it also stretches the medial ligaments. So you can either get kind of lateral knee meniscus kind of issues or medial knee ligamentous issues, particularly if your adductors are way too tight or overactive, or the hip external rotators and extensors aren't strong enough to match that strong pull on the internal adduction pulls. It's all about balancing it out. So before we get into that too much detail about that, let's kind of break down some of the muscles. So I'm going to hide a couple of them here to start with. So we'll hide the gracilis, and we'll hide the sartorius, and we'll hide the pectineus, and we're going to hide the adductor brevis, and we're going to hide the adductor longus. So if we look at this one here, this is Adductor Magnus, and Magnus being the big one, right? And you can see that it essentially attaches the entire shaft of the femur. If we flip it around and do a posterior view, okay, so this line you can see that coming down the back of the femur here, this is called the linea aspiera. So this is like attachment points of the bone. So the hamstrings also attach down this linea aspiera as well. So what's happening there, particularly your bicep femoris, you've got this huge muscle that's going from your pubic bone and ischial bone, so the ischial and pubic bone. So this region here, that's the pubic region there, but it's also then attaching onto the ischium here as well. So you've got this one big adductor muscle that attaches onto the bottom of the pelvis. All right. So anything that's happening to this adductor muscle is going to affect the position of the pelvis. So particularly, and if this muscle is orientated this way, that strong kind of connection of this tendon here, depending on where the femur is orientated. So if the femur is more up this way, or if the femur is behind, it's going to create these different pulls or torques. So it's going to either facilitate the pelvis to be in an anterior tilt or a posterior tilt, depending on where it is. So from this angle here, if the muscle is contracting there, it's going to pull down on the front of the pelvis here on the pubic region. And that on its own is going to create a rotation of the pelvis forward. So it's going to facilitate an anterior tilt. All right. So tight adductors could potentially mean a big anterior tilt for someone. Okay. As this huge muscle is pulling on a downward angle. And if you add in tight quads and a tight hip flexor, oh, my mouse is going to be crazy. Tight quads and a tight hip flexor muscle, that's going to create this really big anterior tilt. So these are things we just need to keep in consideration. And because the attachment, the majority of the attachment is anterior to the axis of the femur, the pivot point of the bone, all right, it's going to create that more pull that way. Now, the other thing it does, which is one of the most underappreciated aspects of the Adductor Magnus, is that when this whole muscle fires, this huge muscle, because it attaches down the shaft of the femur, it's essentially going to pull the whole femur kind of inward and upward. So it's got this kind of upward pulling movement. So it basically keeps the head of the femur really nice and snug in the acetabulum, in the socket. And so it becomes a primary stabilizer in stance. So when you're standing on one leg, so like when you're walking and you're transferring weight from one foot to the other, okay, when that other foot leaves the ground to swing your leg through, this muscle is active to stabilize this whole part of the pelvis in conjunction with the glutes and the hip flexors. They'll all be stabilizing and working together to maintain a really strong, stable foundation for the femur to pivot across. Okay, all right. So a lot of pelvic rehab, lower back rehab, hip rehab, knee rehab, okay, must address this muscle here. This is the bigger one. This is the big kahuna, right? So if you can appreciate this one, the other five basically are doing the same thing that this one does, but in smaller ways because they're smaller muscles, right? So if you just appreciate this big one, you can kind of get a good understanding of the adductor group as a whole, all right? So if you've got, for example, femoral acetibular impingement syndrome, so like a cam lesion or a labral tear here. So femoral acetibular, so FA, so that's the femur. The acetabulum is the socket where the femur sits in, so that big round hole in there. So that's the femoral acetabular joint, or FA. So you can have hip problems there. If this muscle's too tight or too weak, it's going to create more stress on that joint. If you've got sacroiliac joint issues, so this joint through here, where the sacrum sits within the iliacus, the sacroiliac joint, this being a primary stabilizer of the pelvis from inferiorly, if this muscle is weak and if the glute muscles are weak, you're going to get a lot of stress coming through this joint as it's trying to stabilize all your weight going down vertically through here. And that's not going to be a fun time either. So adductor group can have a very important role in stabilizing the sacroiliac joint. Then we've got the pubic joint here, the pubic ramus. So you can get things here where there's a shearing or an uneven pull of left versus right, and you can kind of get like an osteoitis pubis irritation here. Again, adductor group not stabilizing properly or working properly, and then going down the kinetic chain across the knee, as I was talking before, If the adductor group is too tight, hyperactive, and it's creating more of an adductor pull, it can create knee valgus issues particularly. And when you add those up, a knee valgus, femoral acetabular joint, pubic joint, and then sacral leg joint, you can get kind of joint issues in any one of those or all of those if someone's really unlucky. So when you start training and integrating adductor work into your rehab, particularly thinking about how it affects the pelvis and how it affects the glutes and then how it affects the knees, it changes everything, how you look at exercise or functional movement particularly. And you can resolve a lot of problems by doing a lot of adductor work, which is super cool, super cool. They're in yoga, particularly where they're doing a lot of like the warrior 1, warrior 2 stances, lunging stances. People don't know how to use these adductors to stabilize the femur and the knee. And so often you'll see people when you're getting knee problems or SIJ hip problems. And one of the reasons is because they're not actually using these adductor muscles in a very efficient way or effective way. So they're missing out on like probably 33% of this region of muscular activity. That's a huge amount, huge amount. So we've got this big muscle here. It's also so big, it has these kind of like little gaps when you look at it. These little kind of gaps here. And this is for nerves and arteries to kind of thread through to feed different muscles and different systems. So you get a big nerve come down here, sciatic nerve coming through here, blood vessels coming through down back of the knee, that kind of stuff there as well. It has 2 different nerve supplies. It's the L2, L4 nerve. So this kind of top section here is supplied by L2, L4. So we've got a 1, 2, 3, 4. So this region through here. So a lower back injury potentially can affect this muscle here, which can create pelvic instability. And then we've also got tibial division of the sciatic nerve from L4. So, and another branch coming out from the L4. So 2 different nerve branches innervating that muscle. What's good about that is one nerve is kind of interfered with, you've still got another nerve supply to kind of keep the muscle engaged, at least partially, which is pretty good. It's also considered to be a bit of and it has some kind of fascial connections with the hamstrings as well. So particularly the medial hamstrings. So the hamstrings that are on the inside, the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. So it's sometimes considered another hip extensor or hamstring muscle because of when the hamstrings and glutes fire and starts to bring the knee behind that line of pull, it's going to then start to pull upwards. And as soon as that angle changes, it's going to help facilitate extension just because of the angle change, the position of the angle. So that's interesting to know. So this muscle is a hip flexor, it's a hip extensor, it's a hip adductor, and it's a hip external rotator, and sometimes an internal rotator, depending where the position of the hip is. Let's have a look at some of the motion of the adductor. Let's give you a bit more of a visual. A lot of people are very visual learners. So here we go. We've got hip flexion. And this is the Adductor Magnus here, working in hip flexion. So if I fade or and we'll pause just there. So when we're doing hip flexion, any muscle that crosses the hip joint, so any muscle attaches on the pelvis that crosses the hip joint, all right, that brings the knee up towards the chest is a hip flexor. So all our other muscles are going to help with this job here. So we've got Adductor brevis, Adductor longus, maximus, glute max. We'll fade that out. That's not hip flexor. So your butt muscles. So this is a glute max here is on stretch. So that's a hip extensor. So one of the rules we want to kind of think about is with reciprocal inhibition. So when you're flexing the hip, the way the nervous system is kind of set up is that there will be a neural link to the glute max muscle. So the butt muscle, the big glute max muscle. And it'll send a signal to the glute max muscle to relax to allow the hip flexor, the adductor, to pull the knee up towards the chest. All right, so then the glute max, depending on how you're doing it, will either eccentrically lengthen, so it'll be still contracting but under control, it'll be cross bridging but lengthening, or it'll relax and just stretch out passively. So depending where the load's coming from and where gravity is in relation to it. But for example, if you're doing a squat and you're sitting down to a squat, that's going to be eccentrically lengthening. All right. So there'll be a signal to that muscle to tell it to relax enough to lengthen under tension. This is really powerful because if you can train your muscles in a balanced way, if you train the hip flexor or the adductor to its full range of movement, and then you change the butt muscle to their full range of movement, they will balance each other out and they'll stabilize each other, and you will then have a really functional hip joint. All right. The trick is to know which exercises to do and how to balance them and how to prescribe them, which is, what I've spent 20 years learning how to do. So when we assess someone, if they've got like a crazy anterior tilt and we work out that their adductors are really tight without orthopedic testing and just observing how they move, you can kind of see it after a while, the patterning of the human body. Then we go, oh shit, we need to actually get these muscles in a longer and stronger position. Okay, not only in hip flexion, but also in hip adduction. All right, potentially stretch out the glutes, depending on what's going on, or strengthen them, or both. So then we're trying to create this balance between the system. So that's hip flexion. Pretty cool. And so the other hip flexors here is going to be Pectineus, psoas major. So we've got psoas here, and then this is iliacus, two hip flexors. So these two hip flexors work with the adductors to bring the knee up, and these are forgotten muscle groups. Everyone kind of like has a bad rap on the hip flexors. Everyone's like pew pew, the psoas and iliacus, but the stronger you can get these guys in good length, all right, not only are they lumbar stabilizers, they move the femur in motion, like their movement muscles. So the more powerful and strong you can get these bad boys, the more effective your lower limb exercise will be, whether it's crawling, walking, jogging, running, sprinting, jumping, squatting, hinging, lunging, all of other things. All right, you can get these bad boys strong. Not only will you have a strong core, you'll have a really powerful hip flexion. So that's knee drive, and then you need a powerful knee drive to get powerful hip extension, which is hip drive, which is locomotion, which is walking forward, or ambulation, or sprinting. So we want to get those bad boys working good. Let's have a look at Adductor Magnus hip adduction. So in adduction, okay, from here, the knee is way past the midline out to the side, and all these muscles are getting stretched out. So the way to stretch your adductors, your inner thigh muscles, is to take your leg out to the side. Right? So hip adduction. Okay, and then as they contract, they're going to bring the knee back into the middle into hip adduction. All right, and you can go past the midline. So typically, if you found the halfway point of the femoral acetabular joint, so the hip joint, and you dropped a plumb line straight down, what we're typically looking for is the kneecap or the patella to line up with that. Okay, that would be kind of like ideal range of movement. Now, this angle here, when you drop this down there, this angle is going to be different on everyone. Women tend to have a bigger angle because they have a slightly wider and deeper pelvis. All right, and that means that this bigger angle here typically means that they could be more predisposed to these knee movements, or going a bit more valgus or internally orientated. Okay. And then if you can get going further, you can bring the knee way past that kind of center position, and I'll zoom out to the foot. When you're dropping that line down, ideally you want that plumb line, so middle of the hip, middle of the kneecap, patella, and then kind of right through the middle of the arch of the foot. So we probably want somewhere around around there, depending on the orientation, right? So if these muscles are too tight, it's going to be pulling the knee in valgus. Okay, that's going to change the orientation of the knee, and that'll change the kinematics of the ankle as well. And that whole kind of pattern typically winds up in a flat foot. So your flat feet can be related to really crazy tight hip adductors. And so runners, particularly who do a lot of running, or cyclists particularly, which are very powerful hip flexion movements, okay, if they don't do a lot of mobility and stretching work to maintain good tissue quality in the adductor group, you can create this valgus, which then can create flat feet. And so it kind of works its way up and down the kinetic chain. That's a problem too, because then what's going to happen as the foot rolls in, it's going to kind of put more tension on the tib posterior and Achilles, and they're going to have to work harder to control the foot roll. So as your heel strike, the foot rolls naturally. This is a natural roll that occurs, but the more valgus you go in, the more that rolls, and more pressure that's going to go through that mechanism, and that can kind of create Achilles, plantar fascia type problems down the track. All right. So instead of trying to like work these really small intrinsic ankle muscles and like your tib post and stuff like that, which are quite small muscles, you work these massive muscles up here that keep the knee in good alignment, and that really helps stabilize the ankle, which is kind of what we want. So that's adduction. So now if you look again at the adductors, let me take it out here. Okay. All right. So imagine you're standing on one leg and you're kicking your leg out to the side. That's hip abduction. Right. So the muscles that do that are your butt muscles here. So your glute max, glute medius, piriformis attaching here and attaching there, and your hamstrings coming down the back of your leg. They're kind of working to bring your leg out to the side. Now, because of this, the line of the attachment of the adductors are mostly on the back of the femur, and they're pulling in that direction. Okay, that's going to create that external rotation. So when you take your feet out wide, all right, there's going to be a natural rotation of your femur externally, so knees out. All right, okay. Depending on the alignment. So if you're trying to stretch your adductors, what you want to do is take your legs out wide and then do a little bit more hip external rotation. So just turn your foot out and you'll get a deeper hip stretch there in the adductors. And if you want to strengthen them more, you do that. You start with slight external rotation, and then as you bring your foot back into internal rotation from here, you'll bring your adductors in, okay, and that will pull the femur back towards the midline from that full stretch position, so you get the muscles stronger in its most lengthened position. So when a muscle is at its longest, it has a decreased capacity to contract because it doesn't have as much cross-bridging potential, as in there's not much muscle fibers because they're either already fully lengthened out, they don't have much left to contract. So from that position, they can't generate a lot of force. So you typically weaker at the end range. All right, but you want to get strong in the end range because typically that's where injuries happen, all right, when you're going through the end range. So when you're starting your strengthening mobility, you take your leg out to the end range wherever you can, and then you start your execution of that movement through there. And so you'll get a really nice hip stretch or adductor work. Now, the next one is we have hip extension. So let's have a look at the hip extension. So this is how the adductor muscle, particularly Magnus, helps in extension. So you got glute max here in the hamstrings, co-contracting to pull the femur behind you. All right, that's what they do. And then as soon as the femur goes past that kind of point of axis there in the acetabulum, it's going to then switch roles from being an adductor to now a hip extensor. So this is where you get like everything starts to balance each other out. So you've got this muscle pulling in this way, which creates a external rotation. Then you've got the glute max, which attaches more on the lateral aspect of of the femur. So it's going to be pulling that way. So that's also going to be creating an external rotation. Good. Then you've got the bicep femoris here, which is the lateral hamstring muscle, because it's on the lateral side and contracting, it's pulling up and out. So it's going to create another lateral rotation. So you've got those muscles plus the glute medius creating lateral rotation. Okay, so foot turnout, if you will. Then they're balanced out by the actual adductor pull of bringing the whole leg internally. Then the hamstrings on the front, the hamstrings on the medial side are creating a medial rotation. And then you've got the psoas and iliacus coming from here. All right, so they're going to be pulling in and they're going to be creating an internal rotation torque as well. And when you're really functionally balanced, all the different forces are kind of evened out, and then the joint just moves freely, which is what we want. What happens is we get in trouble when these different muscle groups are out of balance or out of sequence or out of sync or not coordinating, is then we get the forces not kind of being balanced through the joints. And then, that often manifests in joint kind of problems, either connective tissue, labral, ligament, tendon, disc, all the above. And that's kind of typically a mechanical kind of view of injury, if you will. So that's really super interesting. So this kind of huge adductor becomes a hip extensor, which is pretty cool. Let's have a look at, we go back. Let's wait others, hide others. Where'd the other ones go? Maybe we're going to undo. Undo. Nope. Okay. We go manual. So let's put in Adductor Longus. So then we have another layer. We hide Magnus. So this is Adductor Longus. So this one comes from the pubic ramus here. It's kind of right in the middle, and then goes on to halfway up the femoral shaft on that linea aspiria. And these are the hip adductors. So these adductors don't cross the knee joint. So these are all the short hip muscles, if you will. So when you're doing something like butterfly stretch, you're really trying to get into this muscle here. And often this is why opening up your hips is really hard to do, because these muscles are so big and so strong. It takes a long time for them to grow longer, all right, to accommodate more hip abduction. So getting flexible is a combination of neurological coordination, so relaxing of the muscle, elastic properties of the muscle, so muscle's ability to stretch and then return to its resting position. But also long-term flexibility is more about growing more sarcomeres, which are like the components of the muscle cells, so they get longer, they actually grow longer. That's what takes longer to actually get flexible, because you can, when the muscles are stretching, they're basically the fibers are sliding across each other, and then they come back to their resting state. Okay. So when you stretch passively, you just pull the muscles apart, and then when you relax to stretch, they just go back to what they were. So passive stretching is often very transient. Long term, the way we get more flexible is to strengthen the tissue, grow the tissue in new lengths, okay, over time. And that takes time, and then also you need to maintain it, because like if you're not taking your limbs through those full range, if the body registers it doesn't need muscle tissue because it's got a high metabolic demand, so it takes a lot of resources to keep, it'll basically pack man back down, and you'll kind of get a little sarcopenia, and so then the muscle will actually atrophy and shrink back to its new resting stage. So whatever you're doing in terms of your training, whatever you achieve, you're going to have to maintain typically to keep that posture or that flexibility or that mobility. It's So one of our kind of rules is you basically need to find an exercise system or style or approach that you like and enjoy that you can do long term, because you're going to be exercising for the rest of your life. May as well just get used to it and do something you enjoy. All right, so let's look at brevis quickly. I'm not going to go through all the super detail of these ones, because once you appreciate one, you start to appreciate them all. And what is a bit of fallacy in kind of it's very difficult to kind of like manual muscle test these bad boys and try to figure out, is it Adductor brevis or is it Adductor longus? Like, very difficult to do. Not very accurate. So you can't really assess it individually. You can get imaging and things like that done. They can tell you which muscle is active or has an injury to it. But in terms of hands-on approach, good therapists, they get a real good sense of which muscles it may be, like their best guess. Like if I'm assessing someone, if the pain's more up the kind of superior aspect of the shaft and it's difficult to palpate because it's literally behind the piguramus, you literally can't palpate that. You can't push your thumb through someone's bone. And if you're coming up under here, this is where the genitals are as well here, so it's quite a sensitive area. So your palpation, you're not going to be palpating into here typically. Well, yeah, there are physios who specialize in pelvic health and all that kind of stuff, and you can definitely do it. It's just typically you don't really need to, or you reserve the people who specialize in the area, because it's a really sensitive area for a lot of folks. But because this muscle and this muscle essentially are doing exactly the same thing, and they're so close together and they're sharing pretty much the same attachment point, it's very difficult to kind of say it's exactly this one. Good manual therapists, good massage therapists, they can kind of get a good sense of it, if you will. All right. So as much as we like to say, this is all science, as there's an art component to it, there's a feel to it that you get good at as you do a lot of therapy. Then we have, if we put in longus, let's put in gracilis, Pectineus, sorry. Pectineus, where are we? Pectineus, I see you. Go. Oh, wrong Pectineus. See where you are at. Blood system, cardiovascular nervous system. So this is all the stuff that I'm not showing you, because you need to go and get your own copy of this app, because it's awesome. Muscles, where are we? Muscles. Here we go. So then we got the Pectineus here. So this one's on the superior pubic ramus. So this one, often rowers and things like that get an irritation of this part here. They can get like a tendonitis through there because they're doing all this hip flexion work and it's rubbing across the top of the pubic bone there. So that bone there. And again, it's kind of touching in on that linea superior, longus, brevis, pectineus. And when you're doing all your inner adductor stretching, you're really trying to get into this one here. So you can imagine like these ones plus Adductor Magnus, when they're all contracting, they're going to basically support the pelvis and the femur. So they become primary stabilizers in stance. Really, 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 really important. So when you learn how to use these muscles correctly, as I said earlier, it just resolves so many problems for so many folks. It's super cool. And then let's put in Gracilis. Gracilis on the left. This is the long one. So here, this one shares the attachment down here with the hamstrings, the semitendinosus. And then on this area called the pes anserine, so you can often get bursts of form here. And then go to long muscle and goes right up again into the kind of pubic ramus area here on the inside. And it's got a little bit of attachment there. So if we go to motion and check out its motion, kind of does a couple of cool different things. It does hip flexion, so it's bringing the knee up. Cool. Now watch it turn a little bit. Turn it around. because it's touching on the anterior medial part of the tibia, it flexes and it rotates the tibia internally a little bit like that. So you get a little bit of, the knee has a little bit of rotation to accommodate different kind of mechanics in the ground. If you had no rotation, it'd be a lot more susceptible to injury. And then, of course, it does a little bit of adduction with the other ones. And then often forgotten is the knee flexion component, because it crosses the knee, it comes and creates knee flexion with the hamstring muscle there and the calf muscles there. People forget often as well that the calves are knee flexors. All right, so knee flexion is hamstrings, adductors, and calves all working together. Just the hamstrings have got the best leverage, so they're typically the ones that do most of the work, which is pretty cool. All right, we'll go back. And then the last one I'll show you before we wrap up today's video is Sartorius. One of my favorite muscles. I don't know why, it's just got a cool name. And we'll do it on the other side because why not? Longest muscle in the body goes from the anterior superior iliac spine to the ASIS, which is the ridge of the hip that just drops off. And just below that is the recfem, which attaches here. So one of your hip flexor muscles. Comes down, wraps around the big quads. That's why it's kind of making that shape. Goes medially and it goes onto the pes anserine. So where the gracilis is here on the same spot. And then it has 4 movements. It does hip abduction. So it's taking the muscle away, but it can also do lateral rotation or medial rotation, sorry. So like the Gracilis is doing, rotating the knee in, hip flexion, and then of course lateral hip rotation. So when the knee bends here, okay, the liner pull of the contraction is going to then turn your foot in, but the femur is rotating outward. Okay, so it changes the orientation of the knee. Muscle. All right. Put Adductor Magnus back in. And there you have the adductor group. So those muscles working together as a group, all 6 of these bad boys, Pectineus, Adductor brevis, Adductor longus, Adductor magnus, Gracilis, Sartorius, all work together to primarily stabilize the femur in the pelvis in stance. So when you're standing on leg, walking, running, jogging, jumping, when you're riding a bike, okay, squatting, lunging, hinging, all those things, primary stabilizers of the pelvis. Hip flexors, so bringing the knee up towards the chest. So think running and jumping. Okay. Hip adductors, so from when the leg's from the outside, it's going to bring the leg into the middle. Hip external rotation, turning the knee out, turning the femur outward. And also hip adductors, so creating more valgus depending on the position of the femur and the feet. Due to the attachment of all these muscles on the anterior aspect of the pelvis, typically has a more of an anterior tilting kind of component to it. So if the gluteals are weak, hamstrings are weak, you can kind of facilitate more of an anterior tilt, and that puts a lot of pressure onto the lumbar spine. So often lower back issues can be relieved by addressing hip adductors and hip flexors. Because when we look at the hip flexors like psoas iliacus rectus femoris, these muscles and these muscles, so if I put them in now, look if we can psoas now. and we'll do a whole video on psoas coming up at some point. Just a quick one here. Mouse is going funny. So this huge muscle here, psoas, is a hip flexor as well. All right, when this muscle goes tight, because it's attaching onto the lumbar vertebrae, it pulls this way in downward, which then kind of feeds into that kind of rotation of the pelvis anteriorly or forward. Okay, and when you add that in with tight hip adductor muscles, which feed that anterior tilt as well, it sets up this posture where you get this really strong, tight anterior musculature, which then weakens out the posterior muscles, so the glutes, particularly lumbar extensors, QLs, and the hamstrings, and that creates a massive imbalance. And then when your spine is challenged, because the forces aren't neutralized correctly, then other tissues and structures mechanically start taking the load. Over a period of time, that can then kind of create wear and tear type issues, which is what we don't want. So when we do an exercise program and it's really well designed and it's very well balanced, you work at all the major muscle groups to the full range of movement with good control, good stability, good mobility. In my experience, you can resolve nearly 95% of musculoskeletal problems when you just train movement correctly. The last 5%, then we assess it, and sometimes it's just people have weird natural anatomy things going on. Sometimes they're just unlucky, you've been injured. Sometimes there's a habit that they've been doing or a technique thing that's not quite correct that's creating a problem. When we address those, then they tend to go away as well. The challenge is that it does require a lot of effort and work, consistency, and patience to build up this really healthy, robust musculoskeletal system. But when you do, it's so worth it, because you've got a body that works, that's out of pain and is functional and allows you to get out in the world and do the things you love to do, which is well worth the effort and the time. So guys, if you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. Let's get this channel cranking so we can help as many people as we can. If you have any questions about musculoskeletal anatomy, maybe you're a therapist or a personal trainer, or you're a physio or exercise physiologist starting out and you want some advice, or just curious, drop me a message in the comments and I'm always happy to answer where I can. All right, until next one, I'll see you all later. Have an amazing day.